The room was still moving when I understood that no one was going to stop it. Not the music, not the conversation, not the particular current of a Buckhead reception hall in full celebration. All of it continued exactly as it had been. Glasses raised, laughter overlapping, the chandelier doing what chandeliers do at these events, throwing light across the faces of people who have paid for the right to feel important for an evening. What stopped was the table nearest to mine, and then the next one, and then the next. The way silence moves outward from a single point when something has been said that cannot be unsaid. My stepson Marcus was still smiling. He had not lowered his glass. He had not adjusted his posture or softened his expression or done any of the small things that people do when they realize they have made a mistake. He held the same position he had been in when he said it. Leaned toward his friend, voice carrying just enough, the smile of a man who has made a calculation and has decided the calculation was correct. What he had said, I will tell you plainly, the way things that hurt should be said plainly. Elizabeth? She married well. That's what women like her do. Not shouted, not slurred. Said the way you say something you have thought privately for a long time and have finally decided is safe to say aloud. Said with the particular ease of someone who believes the room is his, and that the woman he is speaking about has neither the position nor the power to do anything about it. I am 72 years old. I have spent 41 years building a financial advisory practice in Atlanta that bears my name and nobody else's. I have survived a first marriage that ended, a grief that almost did, and the particular education of spending 17 years raising a child who was not born to me and choosing every single day to love him the way he deserved. I sat at the family table at a wedding I helped fund, and I looked at my stepson and I understood. With the clarity that sometimes arrives when the thing you have been trying not to see finally becomes unavoidable, that he had never once looked at me the way I had looked at him. The room was still processing what it had heard. I stood up. My husband Richard stood up first. His chair scraped back, and that sound cut through the reception hall faster than anything said all evening. He looked at Marcus once. He did not raise his voice. He said 4 words in a tone that carried the weight of everything that came after it. You will regret this. Marcus smiled. He said something back. I could see his mouth move, but the blood in my ears had become too loud. Whatever it was designed for the room. Whatever it was, it landed, and several people laughed, and several people stopped laughing almost immediately. The way people stop laughing when they realize they have laughed at the wrong thing in front of the wrong audience. Richard looked at me. I nodded once. We walked out. Not dramatically. Not with pauses in the doorway or final glances. 2 people leaving a room that had finished being worth being in. In the car, Richard drove. I looked at the Atlanta skyline moving past the passenger window, those particular lights, and I said nothing for 11 minutes. I know it was 11 because I was counting without intending to. Counting the way you count when your mind is moving faster than speech and you have decided to let it move. Then I said 1 sentence. Richard heard it. He nodded once and kept driving. I will tell you what that sentence was at the end of this story because it belongs at the end, not here. Here, you need to understand what preceded it. My name is Elizabeth S. Holloway. I am 72 years old. I run Holloway Financial Partners from the 14th floor of a Midtown Atlanta building where my name appears on the door in letters that I chose and paid for myself. I have run that firm for 23 years. Before that, I spent 14 years at 2 of the largest wealth management firms in the Southeast, building a client portfolio and a reputation through work that required more persistence than brilliance, though I had both. I met Richard Patel when I was 51 and he was 54. He was a recently widowed architect with a 12-year-old son named Marcus, a practice he had built from his garage 17 years earlier, and the kind of grief around him that makes quiet people quieter and loud people impossible to be around. I was not quiet, but I was patient. And patience with a man like Richard was the right currency. We married 3 years later. Marcus was 15. I want to tell you who Marcus was at 15, because it matters. Because the person someone is at 15 is not the person they choose to become at 36. And that distance, between who someone was and who they decided to be, is the central geography of this story. At 15, Marcus Patel was a boy who left thank you notes on the kitchen counter in his own handwriting, who asked questions about my work with genuine curiosity, who, on the Sunday mornings when Richard was on job sites, would come downstairs and make coffee badly and sit across from me at the kitchen table and talk about whatever he had been thinking about, the way young people talk to adults they have decided to trust. I trusted him back. I taught him to drive. I attended every significant thing his school produced. I covered for him twice in ways that cost me something. Once when he made a financial decision at 22 that Richard would have cut off entirely, and once at 26 when something happened that he needed handled quietly, and I handled it. Neither time did he ask why I helped. Neither time did I require thanks. That was my mistake, not the helping, the not requiring. I had been so determined not to be the stepmother of narrative, the obstacle, the intruder, the woman his father chose who displaced the mother he had lost, that I had overcorrected entirely. I had made myself so available, so non-threatening, so reliably present, that Marcus had eventually organized his understanding of me around my availability rather than my value, around what I provided rather than who I was. Women do this. I am not the first, and I will not be the last. We bend ourselves into shapes that make others comfortable, and then we are surprised when those others begin to treat the bent shape as the truth of us. The wedding where Marcus made his remark was his own wedding. He had married a woman named Sophia Calloway, Sophia of the Calloway Group, which, if you move in Atlanta's commercial real estate circles, requires no further explanation. A family with the kind of name that opens certain rooms and closes others. A family who had, over the 2 years of Marcus and Sophia's engagement, subtly and then less subtly communicated their interest in understanding the full financial picture of the family Sophia was marrying into. I had noticed this. I had filed it. I had not yet understood what it meant. The wedding dinner remark clarified it. Women like her. 2 words that told me exactly how Marcus had described me to his new family. Not as the woman who raised him, not as his father's wife of 17 years. Not as the architect of a financial practice that had, among other things, helped fund the first decade of Marcus's own career, but as someone who had married into something. As a category rather than a person, as a type rather than a woman. He had spent 2 years positioning me as the lesser thing, so that the Calloway family would understand his inheritance differently, so that the assets Richard and I had built together would read as Richard's alone, so that what came to Marcus would appear to come cleanly without the complication of my name being attached to any of it. I understood all of this in the car, in 11 minutes of silence, with the Atlanta skyline moving past my window. Then I said my one sentence. Then I went home. Then I went to work. I was at my desk before 7 the next morning. My assistant Claudette arrived at 7:30, set coffee on my desk without asking, pulled the chair across the table, and sat down without asking what was wrong. 11 years of working beside someone teaches them when to wait and when to sit. She sat. I told her enough. Not everything. The shape of what had happened and the shape of what I was going to do about it. She said, the Henderson file, the contribution records. I said all of it. She nodded and went to work. The Henderson file was what I called the property documentation I had maintained since Richard and I purchased our first joint investment property in 2012. Not because it was named after anyone, because I had filed it behind a client placeholder as a habit of organization, and the habit had become its own kind of protection. Inside, 11 years of financial contribution records for every joint property Richard and I owned. The Buckhead House, the Midtown investment property, the commercial unit in Decatur that we had purchased 4 years ago as part of a retirement strategy I had designed and presented to Richard on a Tuesday evening over dinner. My name appeared on every deed. My income had contributed specifically documented percentages to every purchase. The paper trail was not a paper trail. It was an architecture, built over a decade, precise, corroborated by bank records, tax filings, and the professional opinion of the financial advisor who had structured every purchase. That financial advisor was me. I had built this, Not because I expected to need it, but because I was a financial professional and documentation was not a strategy for people in trouble. It was a discipline for people who understood that clarity protects everyone, including the people you love. I pulled the files and laid them across my desk in sequence. Then I opened my laptop and accessed the document I had written 3 years earlier. Not a memo, a personal record, detailed, dated, and sent to my own professional email, which put a timestamp on it that predated anything Marcus could now claim was constructed in response to the wedding, documenting a conversation I had overheard at a family dinner in which Marcus had described the Buckhead property to Sophia's brother as essentially Dad's to leave however he wants. I had noted it. I had filed it. I had said nothing. I had loved Marcus enough to give him room to be wrong before I required him to be right. He had used that room to build a narrative. I opened my phone and called an attorney named Dr. Patricia Osei. Patricia had been my attorney for estate planning for 9 years. She was 63 years old, meticulous, and possessed of the specific patience of someone who has spent decades watching people make decisions their feelings insisted on, while their documentation did not support. She had, on more than one occasion, looked across her desk at me and said something that I had written down and kept. She answered on the second ring. I told her everything. She listened without interrupting. When I finished, she asked 2 questions. Is your income contribution to all 3 properties documented in a way that predates any current dispute? Yes. Is Marcus's name on any deed or any document that could support an ownership claim against your interest? No. She was quiet for one moment. Then she said, Elizabeth, what do you want? I had thought about this in the car the night before. I had organized it in the 11 minutes of silence. I said, I want the record to reflect the truth. I want what belongs to me formally established in a way that cannot be reframed by anyone's subsequent account of what the family understood. And I want to understand the full extent of what Marcus communicated to the Calloway family about this estate before I decide what to do with that information. Patricia said, I can begin the asset protection filing this week. I said, do it. She said, and the second part? I said, give me a few days. Richard came home the evening after I had met with Patricia. He had not used the time between the wedding and that evening in the way some men use time, deflecting, minimizing, looking for the framing that made everything smaller than it was. Richard Patel was not that kind of man. He was an architect. He understood that structures reveal themselves under load, and what he had seen at that wedding had told him something about his son's structure that no conversation could have communicated more clearly. He sat at the kitchen table. I sat across from him. He said, I called my attorney this morning. I said, so did I. He said, the will is being restructured. I said, tell me what that means. He told me, not with anger, not with the particular theatrical grief of a father performing devastation, with the flat, measured tone of a man who has made a decision he knows is right and is prepared to live inside it. The estate documents that had listed Marcus as the primary beneficiary of Richard's share of their jointly held assets were being revised. The revision would establish with legal precision that the jointly held assets were not solely Richard's to bequeath, that my ownership interest was documented, real, and would be addressed separately and on my own terms. It would also reduce Marcus's specific inheritance in ways that reflected what Richard now understood about the years of financial misrepresentation that had preceded the wedding. Richard had also done something I had not asked him to do. He had called Marcus. The call had been brief. He had asked Marcus if there was anything he wanted to say. Marcus had said the dinner had been a social situation and that people were being oversensitive. Richard had said, all right. Then he had ended the call. I thought about that word for a long time afterward. All right, not a concession, not a door left open. A record of what Marcus had said followed immediately by the signal that the conversation was over. The particular finality of a quiet man who has made a decision he will not revisit. I said, he doesn't know what's coming. Richard said, no. He thinks this will settle. He always has, Richard said. Every time he has done something he should not have done, he has waited for it to resolve, and it has resolved, because we loved him enough to let it. I looked at my husband. We're not letting it this time. No, he said. We're not. We sat in the kitchen in the quiet of what we had both decided, separately and together, in the 24 hours since a room full of people had laughed at something that was not funny. Then Richard reached across the table and covered my hand with his. That was the whole conversation. The Calloway family's involvement became clear to me in stages. The first stage was a text message I received 4 days after the wedding from a woman named Diana, who worked in commercial real estate development, and who moved, as I did, through Atlanta's professional networks, in ways that meant we were connected by approximately 2 degrees to almost everyone relevant. Diana had been at a dinner the previous evening. Sophia's eldest brother, James Calloway, had been seated across from her. James was on the board of 3 organizations Diana was connected to professionally. The dinner had been about something unrelated entirely. But James had said something in the course of the evening that Diana, knowing my connection to the Patel family, had felt I should know. He had said, Richard Patel's practice has done well, but the estate has some complications. The wife is, I think the family situation is more layered than Sophia understood going in. Diana had texted me the following morning. She had simply written, "Thought you should know. Call me if you want context." I called her. What she described was not a single conversation. It was a pattern of things Marcus had apparently communicated to the Calloway family during the 2 years of the engagement. Things about the estate structure, things about the properties, things about my role in the family that framed me as temporary, as secondary, as someone whose financial position was dependent on Richard's goodwill rather than on documented contribution and legal ownership. Marcus had spent 2 years constructing a version of the Patel family estate that erased me from it, not carelessly, because the Calloway family's interest in the financial solidity of their daughter's marriage required a clean picture, and I was not a clean picture if my name was on every significant asset. So he had removed me from the story, if not from the deeds. I thanked Diana, I documented the call, I sent the notes to Patricia. Then I called Patricia and told her to add a discovery element to the filing. I wanted the formal record to include documented requests for communications between Marcus Patel and members of the Calloway family during the period of the engagement, specifically any communications that referenced the Patel estate structure, the properties, or my financial position. Patricia said, "That is a significant expansion." I said, "It reflects the actual scope of what happened." She said, "I'll prepare it." Marcus was served at his office on a Thursday afternoon. I know the timing because Patricia's assistant confirmed it. I know what happened afterward because Richard told me that evening, and because what Marcus did in the 4 hours between being served and calling Richard told me everything I needed to know about where he actually stood. He called his father-in-law first. Not Richard, James Calloway. The call lasted 22 minutes. James Calloway was a man who had spent 30 years in commercial real estate and who understood from the first sentence of that call what a formal filing with a discovery request attached to it meant for a family like his. It meant that 18 months of communications between Marcus and members of the Calloway household were now potentially subject to court review. It meant that every conversation in which Marcus had described the Patel estate in ways that the actual documentation did not support could become part of a formal legal record. The Calloway family had a foundation, 3 board seats on civic organizations, a name that appeared on a building near Peachtree, and 2 other places in Atlanta where names that appear on buildings carry institutional weight. James Calloway understood in 22 minutes that the exposure the discovery request created was not primarily about a wedding remark. It was about what his family had been told, what they had relied on, and what the gap between the telling and the truth now looked like in a formal legal document. Marcus called Richard 40 minutes later. The call lasted 4 minutes. Marcus's voice had lost, according to Richard, its characteristic register. The ease was gone. What had replaced it was the sound of a man who had called the wrong person first and had just realized it. He told Richard that Elizabeth had filed something. He asked if Richard was going to address it. Richard said, "She has every right." Marcus said, "Dad." Richard said, "I know what you told the Callaways." The call ended. The Callaway family moved in a particular way after that, and the movement told me everything. Families with significant civic and professional exposure do not sit still when discovery requests name them. They assess. They calculate. They determine what the gap between their private communications and their public positions looks like when examined by someone whose job is to examine it. 3 days after Marcus was served, James Calloway's personal attorney called Patricia's office. Not to discuss settlement, not to negotiate, to confirm receipt, and to ensure that the Calloway family's position was formally acknowledged as separate from Marcus Patel's personal conduct. That call told me 2 things. 1, the Callaways were frightened. 2, they had already decided that Marcus was on his own. Patricia called me that afternoon. She said, "The Callaways have retained separate outside counsel. They've put distance between themselves and Marcus formally and quickly." I said, "How quickly?" The call came in 36 hours after service. I sat with that for a moment. "He called them first," I said. "Yes," Patricia said. "And they responded by calling us and clarifying that they are not his legal shield." Marcus had gone to his father-in-law's family believing he had married into protection. He had discovered in 36 hours that protection of the kind he had imagined required him to have been honest about what he was offering them in return. And he had not been honest. He had told them the estate was simpler than it was. He had told them my position was lesser than it was. He had told them, implicitly and repeatedly over 2 years, that the Patel assets were Richard's to dispose of freely, and that the disposal would benefit the family Marcus was joining. None of that was true. And the Callaways, looking at a discovery request that put their private communications about all of it under potential judicial review, were no longer interested in standing beside that story. Sophia came to see me, not through attorneys, not with scheduled preparation. She called my direct number on a Wednesday evening and asked if I would meet her. She suggested a restaurant in Virginia Highland, neutral ground, far enough from Buckhead that neither of our circles would be watching. I said yes. I said yes because I wanted to look at this woman that Marcus had chosen and understand what she knew and when she had known it. Not out of anger, out of the specific need that sometimes comes when you are trying to see the full picture of something before you close it. She arrived before me. She was already seated, hands around a water glass she wasn't drinking from, watching the door with the particular attention of someone who wasn't certain the person they were waiting for would actually come. I arrived exactly on time. I ordered coffee. I sat down across from her. I waited. She spoke first. She said she had not known. She said Marcus had told her the estate was straightforward, that Richard had structured things to simplify them, that there was no complexity around the properties. She said she had not asked more detailed questions because she had not believed more detailed questions were necessary. She said her father had called her the morning after speaking with his attorney and told her that the discovery request referenced communications that she had been part of. Conversations at family dinners in which Marcus had discussed the Patel assets in specific terms. Terms that the formal documentation, now reviewed by 2 attorneys, did not support. She said, "I repeated things he told me to my father that were not true, and I didn't know they were not true." I looked at her for a long moment. Then I said, "I raised Marcus from the time he was 12 years old. I attended every significant thing that mattered to him. I covered for him when covering cost me something real. I did those things because I chose to love him the way he deserved, and because I believed that what we were building together as a family was worth the investment of everything I gave to it." She was listening with the full attention of someone who understands they are hearing something they will not hear again. I said, "What your father was told about this estate was not an accident, and it was not a misunderstanding. It was a construction, built over 2 years, designed to make what belongs to me look like it belongs to someone else. And I need you to understand that distinction, not because I want you to feel responsible for it, but because the person you married made that choice and you deserve to know the truth of it." Something moved across her face, not the composure she had arrived with, something underneath it. the specific expression of a person who has been given information that changes the shape of everything they believed they understood. She said, "What happens now?" I said, "The filing proceeds. The record will reflect what's true, and what you and your family do with that is your decision." She looked at her water glass. "My father is furious," she said, "not with you." "I know," I said. I paid for the coffee. I put on my coat. I said goodbye to Sophia Calloway Patel, and I walked out of that restaurant, and I drove home to Richard, and I told him everything. He listened without interrupting. When I finished, he said, "I'm sorry." I said, "For what?" "For raising him in a way that made him believe he could take things from people he was supposed to love." I looked at my husband. This man who had built something from a garage, and built a son, and built 17 years of a life with me in the house on Buckhead where both our names were on the deed. And I said, "You didn't raise him to be what he chose to become. Those are different things." Richard looked at me. "I know," he said, "but I'm sorry anyway." 11 weeks after the wedding, Marcus came to the house on Buckhead. He had not called ahead. His car appeared in front of the house on a Saturday morning, and he sat in it without moving for a long time. I saw him from the upstairs window. He had parked slightly offset from the driveway. Not in it, not retreating, suspended somewhere between the two, which told me everything about where he was internally. I counted the minutes while he sat. 13. Then I went downstairs and opened the front door before he could knock. He was standing on the second porch step. He looked at me, and his face did something I had not seen it do before. Something that had nothing to do with the performance he had been giving at the wedding, or in the months of silence that followed. Something that required an adjustment in his face before it fully arrived, because seeing me clearly, I think, required adjusting something he had spent years obscuring. He asked if he could come in. I stepped aside. We sat in the living room, the room where I had chosen every piece of furniture across the first years of this marriage. The house whose financial architecture I had built as carefully as I had built my professional practice. Marcus had something prepared. I could tell from the first sentence, the particular smoothness of language that has been arranged in advance. He started with an explanation of context, moved to an account of external pressures, and was arranging his way toward something that was meant to sound like an apology without fully being one. I let him speak. I let the prepared language run out, which it did in approximately 90 seconds, because prepared language requires the other person to respond on schedule, and I did not. The silence after his prepared words ran out was the most productive silence in that room. What came out of him in it was not the apology he had rehearsed. It was something more complicated and considerably more honest. He said he had spent years believing that belonging to the Calloway family would give him something he had not been able to name when he was young, but had always felt the absence of. A kind of solidity, a kind of confirmed arrival, something that would mean he did not have to keep calculating whether what he had was enough. He said that pursuing that had required him to construct a version of the estate, of this family, of me, that positioned him as the rightful center of it. That made what I had contributed look like something that would eventually pass through him rather than something that belonged to me independently and permanently. He said he had told himself I wouldn't notice. He said he understood now that I had noticed from the beginning. He looked at his hands. He said, "I never once looked at what you gave this family and called it what it was." I was quiet for a long moment. Then I told him the truth. Not with anger. I had spent that long before we reached this room. Not with the satisfaction of someone who has won something. This was not a victory I had built toward for pleasure. I told him I had raised him from the time he was 12 years old, not because I was required to, not because Richard had asked me to, but because I had looked at a boy who had lost his mother and decided, freely and without condition, that he deserved someone who would show up for him completely. I told him that every time I covered for him, every choice I made that cost me something, was made from something genuinely maternal. The kind of feeling that does not require biology to be real. The kind that arrives when you decide to love a child who is not yours, and you keep deciding it every day for 17 years. I told him that the wedding dinner was not a moment of weakness or a social miscalculation. It was the expression of a belief about me that he had built, brick by brick, over 2 years, in conversations with a family he was trying to impress. And that belief, that I was the lesser thing, the convenient category, the woman who had married well rather than the woman who had built well, that belief had a history inside him that predated the dinner by years. I told him I did not hate him. I told him I was finished. He sat with that for a long time. Then he said, "Is there anything?" I said, "No." Not harshly, just clearly. The way you say no when you mean it entirely and do not require the other person to understand the full architecture of your decision, only to receive it. He left. The door closed. I stood in the hallway of the house where I had lived for 17 years, and I listened to the quiet of it, and I thought about the boy who used to leave thank you notes on the kitchen counter. That boy and this man were the same person. I had loved one of them longer than the other deserved. The grief in that was real. I will not pretend it wasn't. The grief of realizing that someone you poured yourself into had been taking inventory all along, that what you offered as love had been received as resource, is its own particular kind of loss. It does not require a dramatic scene to be serious. It requires only the moment of seeing it clearly. I had been seeing it clearly for 11 weeks. I had done what needed to be done. Patricia called on a Tuesday morning in October. I was already at my desk. The city was doing what Atlanta does in October. The light shifted, the heat finally conceded, the particular quality of the morning air different in the way that signals a genuine seasonal change rather than a temporary one. She read me the findings. The asset protection filing, complete. My financial interest in all 3 properties, the Buckhead House, the Midtown Investment Property, the Decatur Commercial Unit, formally established and documented in permanent public record. The contribution records, the deed percentages, the documented financial history of every purchase, all of it now part of the formal record in Fulton County Superior Court in a way that no subsequent account of family understanding could alter. The civil claim, partially upheld. The judge had found that the documented pattern of conduct, the inheritance misrepresentation across 2 years of formal engagement period communications, the public expression at the wedding as the culminating act in an established sequence, the professional and personal impact on Elizabeth S. Holloway, constituted sufficient grounds for the claims that survived. The language she used was careful and specific. Not every element had survived intact, but enough had. Enough for the court to formally recognize a pattern rather than an incident. Limited compensatory damages, attorney's fees addressed. Patricia finished reading. I thanked her. We handled the logistics. Then I hung up and sat in my office in the quiet of what had just entered the permanent record. Not triumphant, something more durable than triumph. Certain. The consequences moved the way consequences move in cities like Atlanta. Quietly at first, then less quietly. Derek Ashford, a colleague who had been at the wedding dinner and who moved through Atlanta's financial and civic networks at a level where his professional associations mattered, posted something on his professional social media the week after the filing became public record. He had not named anyone. He was too careful for that. What he wrote was simple, that he had witnessed conduct at a private event that conflicted with his professional values, and that he had decided to create distance from the professional relationships connected to it. No names, no specifics beyond what people with enough context would privately recognize. I did not share it. I did not comment. I documented it, the date, the platform, the approximate professional reach, and sent the documentation to Patricia. Then I watched what it did. Atlanta's Black professional community is smaller than it appears from the outside and more interconnected than most people from outside it understand. The post moved through specific circles. People who recognized enough of the description to connect it privately to the Callaway name began asking careful questions. Institutional people who were connected to the Callaway Foundation and its associated organizations began recalibrating in the ways that institutional people recalibrate when a name they have staked credibility on becomes associated with publicly visible conduct concerns. Nothing dramatic, no press, No public declarations, just the quiet but measurable friction of a name that had lost some of its automatic opening power in rooms where it used to open doors without question. The Callaway Foundation Board requested a conversation with James Callaway about governance and family-connected reputational matters. James attended. He answered questions I will never know the content of. What I know is that Evelyn Callaway resigned from 2 civic committees in the weeks that followed. No statement, just absence where presence had previously been automatic. And Marcus's position at Callaway Properties, the position that had been the concrete proof of his arrival into a family he had spent 2 years earning the right to join, began to change. Not dramatically, just the slow, measurable reorganization of professional responsibility that happens when a firm is managing the liability attached to a person rather than investing in their potential. I did not cause any of that. I had filed a legal claim that reflected the truth. I had documented what was true. I had let the truth move at its own pace through the professional environment that Marcus and the Callaway family had built their public lives inside. The truth did not need my help. It only needed me to stop covering it. Sophia called me 6 weeks after the court findings. Not the careful, prepared Sophia of the restaurant in Virginia Highland. Something different. She called on a Sunday morning when the city was quiet, and she sounded like someone who had been carrying a decision for several weeks, and had finally decided to put it down by saying it aloud. She said, "I want you to know that I had a conversation with Marcus after the findings. I told him what I understood now about what he had said to my family and what it had done." I said, "How did he respond?" She was quiet for a moment. "He said he didn't think it would go this far." I recognized those words. They were the words of a man who had believed, until the last moment, that consequence was something that happened to other people. Sophia said, we're not." She stopped, started again. "I don't know what happens now between him and me. I don't know if I can build something real with someone who did what he did. But I wanted you to know that I'm not pretending it was something other than what it was. I said that's more than a lot of people manage." She said, "I'm sorry, Elizabeth, for what you absorbed, for what you were never thanked for." I sat with that for a moment. "Thank you," I said. We said goodbye. I sat in the quiet of my study for a while after that call, not with relief, not with any of the emotions that come with resolution, because what I felt was not resolution. What I felt was something more like the particular steadiness of a person who has been in motion for a long time and has arrived, finally, at the place they were moving toward. I am writing this from my desk in the Holloway Financial Partners office on the 14th floor of a midtown building, where my name is on the door in letters I chose and paid for myself. Outside, Atlanta is doing what Atlanta does in autumn, moving fast and indifferent and full of people building things. Richard and I had dinner at home last night. He cooked. We talked about things that had nothing to do with any of this. The particular quality of an ordinary evening that has been chosen rather than merely arrived at. Marcus exists at the edges of my life now, the way a closed chapter exists, present in the sense that it happened, absent in the sense that it no longer requires anything from me. Richard knows very little of where he is. The silence between them has settled into something neither hostile nor hopeful. Just the natural distance between people whose choices have taken them somewhere they cannot return from, without doing something they have not yet done. I do not spend time in that distance. I have my own geography. And now I will tell you the sentence I said in the car. 11 minutes of silence. The Atlanta skyline moving past the passenger window. Richard driving. The particular stillness of 2 people who have been through something together and are still inside it. Then I said, "Richard, nothing that belongs to me is going to be rewritten by anyone who underestimated me. Not tonight. Not ever." That was all. He nodded once. He kept driving. And I looked out at the lights of the city I had spent 23 years building a practice inside, and I understood, with the specific clarity that comes when you have stopped accommodating something that deserved to be confronted, exactly what I was going to do. I went home. I slept, I got up before sunrise, and I went to work. My name is Elizabeth S. Holloway. I am 72 years old. I built my firm from nothing. I raised a boy who chose to forget what I was to him. I married a man who never did. I documented everything. I loved completely, and then I stopped covering. And everything that followed was simply the truth. Finally, moving at its own pace, through a world that had been organized around the assumption that I would keep it quiet. I did not keep it quiet. I did not need to raise my voice. I just stopped being the reason it stayed hidden. That was enough. That was everything. If this story gave you something, a language for what you have been watching happen, a clarity about what belongs to you and what does not, please share it with someone who needs to hear it. Tell me in the comments where you are watching from. Tell me what you have built. Tell me what you stopped covering. Because somewhere in what you stopped covering, the truth was always waiting to move. And it moves faster than anyone who underestimated you ever expected.